Hi, this is Mike Benoit, and the purpose of this video is to take you out of the matrix, the tyranny upon your mind when it comes to the income tax. I'm going to talk about my journey through the Internal Revenue Code, or my journey out of the matrix in regard to taxes. Back in 1988, I sold a house, and when I went down to buy another house, couldn't afford the house that I sold, so I had to buy a lesser expensive house. And back in that day, they used to hit you with capital gains taxes if you didn't buy a house that was equal or greater value than the one you sold. They changed the law after that. But comes 1989, comes time to file 1988 tax returns. Well, I didn't have the money. I invested it in a company that I started with a friend, and we were just barely getting off the ground, so I didn't have any money to pay that tax bill. Well, then next year, same problem, didn't get out of it, so I didn't file for 1988 and 1989. Then it happened again in 1990. So I didn't have the money to pay any taxes for those years. And then when they finally caught up with me and said, "Hey, Mr. Benoit, you owe all this money. You owe for the taxes, you owe interest and penalties, you owe, you name it, just more and more things they wanted me to give them money for." And started adding it all up and tried to pay them a couple $100. I think it might have been a couple $100 a month or whatnot. And I started adding up how much they had in there with their interest and penalties, and I was saying, there's no way in the world I can get out from underneath this. So what I did was started digging into the tax laws and started digging into studying my Constitution. And I was saying, there's something wrong here, because the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibited slavery or involuntary servitude, and that's certainly the condition that I found myself in. So then I started studying one anti-tax tyranny guru after another. I studied with the what's the name of that group? Save a Patriot Foundation or Fellowship. I studied all the material that they had. Read a book by a guy named Frank Kowalik. Forget, IRS Humbug was the title of that book. Read all of Irwin Schiff's books. Read Lynn Meredith's books, Vultures in Eagles' Clothing, How to Cook a Vulture. One book after another, can't recall all of them. And then I finally landed on to Otto Skinner's books, The Best Kept Secret, If You're the Defendant, and what's that other one I got over there? The Biggest Tax Loophole of All. I've got two bookcases full of tax books, or anti-tax tyranny books, if you will. And so after studying all of this, one thing was certain, that there's a lot of wild theories out there on why we didn't have to pay an income tax. And so consequently, it's pretty confusing. People will read this, and people knew it was tyranny, so just as they grabbed onto the idea that you had to pay an income tax, they would grab onto an idea that here's the reason why you don't have to pay an income tax. Now the IRS actually sends a booklet out saying these are frivolous taxpayer arguments. And actually every one of those arguments that they call frivolous, I too would call frivolous, especially after all the studying I've done. Except for one, where they quote a appellate court decision, which quotes an interpretation of a Supreme Court case, which is wrong, just plain wrong. I don't have that material in front of me right now. So as I studied all this stuff, I figured out, well, guess what? There is no law that requires us to pay an income tax. Now, this is something probably 1 out of 100,000 people have come to that conclusion. Most of the people in this country believe that it's the law and you have to do it, and a lot of them believe that it's the price that you pay for freedom. You got to pay income tax. That's the price you pay for freedom. Well, because it's such a big scam that half the people at the lower end of the taxing scene they don't pay any income tax. They get the income tax credit back, so they're not actually paying it, but the illusion is that they're paying it. And then you have the illusion on the rich people in this country that they're paying taxes, when most of the time they can just pass it on in the cost of their goods and services that we all buy. So the bottom line to all of that is most of us are hoodwinked into believing that there is a income tax, that you have to pay it, and that's that, and there's no way around it. Well, I also wrote a book on the income tax, and I wrote it as sort of a stepping stone, if you will, or step ladder to get up to Otto Skinner's books. And my book is called Tyranny Busters, The Sham and Shame of the Federal Income Tax. Now, in that book, it's less than 100 pages, and we try to put out a clear, concise understanding of just what the income tax laws are and what they're not. Okay, and since there's so many theories here on why you don't have to pay an income tax, and all these books, you get into them, and it's really a confusing subject. If anybody has had no experience getting into reading the federal laws or state and county laws or whatever, you can get real jumbled up real quick in regards to the any kind of law. And the in Title 26, the Internal Revenue Code, is no exception, and especially because there's people who have all these different interpretations of why you don't have to pay an income tax, and boy, they're pretty sure that they're right, and it's actually their mind trying to come up with a solution to something that just doesn't jive with the Constitution, and it just doesn't jive with free people. So they come up with theories that, if you're a sovereign state citizen, then you're not a U.S. citizen, and they mean U.S. citizen in the sense that you're not a citizen of the District of Columbia or Puerto Rico or territories of the United States. So there's their theory, and that's why you don't have to pay an income tax. And there's other people who come up with a theory that, they don't have, how do you figure it? Well, let's see. They use this argument referred to as 861 argument, and they go into arguing that they don't have income within the it's only income that's without the United States that's taxable. And again, one theory after another, some folks will argue that the 16th Amendment wasn't properly ratified, therefore I don't have to pay taxes. And all of these arguments that I've found, and Otto Skinner covers this, most of the people that argue in all these other ranges are arguing why they don't have to pay a tax, as if the tax actually exists. Okay, and so they'll say, I don't owe the income tax because of this theory or that theory or this theory or that theory. Okay, when I got done with all this research and all the studying of all this material, and as I'm studying it, even as I start to get this, starts to seem like here's a good theory, it would unwind. There would be something that didn't jive with it, okay? And like the argument, income taxes are voluntary, and then, or the argument, it's voluntary compliance and voluntarily self-assessed. And people would say, if you make those arguments, then all the government has to do is dispel the notions that, of course taxes are not voluntary. So boom, the default is that you owe income taxes. All right. So in studying all the constitutional questions regarding income taxes, all the constitutional cases, and in keeping in mind all these theories that I've been dispelling here were theories that go out and prove why you didn't owe an income tax. Now, if you actually don't owe an income tax, it shouldn't be your burden to prove that you don't owe it. Okay, it should be the government's burden to prove that you do owe it. And that makes, in a court of law, any lawyer, it seems to me any lawyer would say, don't put the burden of proof on you if you don't have to put the burden of proof on you. It just makes sense. Put the burden of proof on your adversary. And of course, that in this case we're talking about the IRS. Well, getting in there and you dig in there, you start to learn a little bit about taxation in general, constitutional taxation, and you find out the Constitution talked about two different classes or categories of taxation. They talked about direct and indirect taxes. Okay, and simply direct taxes were taxes on people or property, and indirect taxes were taxes on some kind of activity. And then of course you can dig into this, and this is a simple, I'm giving you a condensed version of tens of thousands of hours of studying here, but it's pretty much that simple. And if you were to put the time in there, you'd find that that's what the case is. So, and if the Constitution talked about direct taxes having to be apportioned, and indirect taxes had to be uniform. And when the Constitution referred to direct taxes having to be apportioned, it referred to the fact it had to be apportioned among the different states according to the census, which means according to the population in each state. An example would be if California had 12% of the people and the federal government needed $100 billion, California's share would be $12 billion. And that would be, and they, of course, would tax people direct for that, tax property direct for that. Maybe go put a tax, divide that 12 billion on all the property through the state and collect it that way. And there would be your direct taxes. Now, your other category of taxation is your indirect taxes, and that would be on things like, you could, gasoline excise tax is an indirect tax. Or you could have alcohol distillation tax, and that would be, an indirect tax. It'd be a tax on an activity. And again, once again, direct taxes on people or property, those are nouns if you'll think of it that way too. And then indirect taxes on activities. Okay, pretty simple, there it is. But even though that was simple, there was confusion that came into the game when Congress would write some tax laws. And these tax laws would be overturned. For example, previous income tax laws previous to the 16th Amendment would be overturned on the basis that the tax actually would go to tax property, and property taxes were direct taxes, and so therefore, and it wasn't apportioned, and it was being treated like an indirect tax, a tax on some activity, but it was actually reaching and taxing property, so of course would void that for that purpose. Then along comes the 16th Amendment. Most of us think the 16th Amendment gave Congress some new power to tax incomes, and then we think of incomes, we think of that what comes to us from our labor, and that's a confusion too. But the Supreme Court in 1916 on two cases, a case called, one of the parties was Bruce Shaver, another case Stanton. I only remember the one name of these things instead of the whole thing. It's easier, you can look them up. But in those court decisions, I think they were decided the same day, if not one after another. And the Supreme Court said that the 16th Amendment did not give Congress any new power. So if it didn't give Congress any new power, it had the power to tax incomes previously. But what is meant by taxing incomes? Did it mean that they're taxing the dollars that we get from an activity that we call income as a direct tax on property? Or was it the activity that's being taxed? And the dollars were simply a measure, or the income was simply a measure of the profit, and it wasn't the subject of the tax, but it was the measure of the tax. So if they always had the power to tax income, then the confusion would be, I guess, when the courts would take and say, well, even though you're taxing a corporation's profit, the activity of operating as a corporation, that's my term there, then, and you're using income to measure the tax, then you're still taxing, it's still an indirect tax, it's not a direct tax, and therefore it's constitutionally sound or viable because we're not actually taxing property without apportionment, and that all makes sense. Okay, so, revenue taxable activities. Just another example of a revenue taxable activity, gambling in the Internal Revenue Code is a revenue taxable activity,